Hi, I'm Mark Clegg. Welcome to the Photographer Academy, and today we're talking about kind of getting the exposure right in camera. It's very difficult to get a perfect exposure when we're kind of photographing in the different kind of lifestyle, different light conditions, locations, wherever we are, bright sunny days, dark clouds and so on with it. And it's even worse, in fact, if we're trying to use an automatic mode. We'll talk about that now in a minute. So one of the kind of things I'm going to be talking about is kind of really using manual exposure to kind of meter and basically in camera get it right, instead of basically shooting a whole load of images and testing it and then actually having to cherry pick across them and things. So when we're looking at getting the exposure right, I mean, the image on the left-hand side I chose because there's a lot of whites. So if you looked at the histogram, it would absolutely be skyrocketing on one end, and it would kind of be a little bit of information on the dark end. But really what we want to look at is if we're using the exposure information, you know, the little dial at the bottom of the camera viewfinder, we can pretty much control what we're trying to achieve. So again, the same thing would be on a day like today, in other words, like this image, basically because it's got a deep dark blue sky ish in Wales, and then we've got a little bit of pebble, but a majority is the mid-tone. We've got a rock and obviously a branch which isn't white, it's kind of a silvered branch. We've got kind of a working grey exposure in here. So this is a kind of image where the camera in an automatic mode would cope very well. Whereas the last image that we're looking at, basically what it would do, it's probably going to underexpose the image because it's going to be seeing so much white and bright, and then obviously you're relying on things to actually make that correction. Now, if you're using a smartphone, you're probably already used to actually touching the place where you want to expose from, or moving your finger around the screen to change the exposure, and we can do exactly that within the camera itself. So first of all, you know, I'm here to talk about manual today and encouraging you to kind of shoot more like a pro and actually understand the exposure, why the exposure is going to be kind of giving you great images each time. And so you can understand the scene and how you're walking into a scene, so you know what to actually set the camera on to begin with before you even bring it to your camera, eye, I should say. So besides from manual, we've got other automatic modes, of course. Manual plus the auto ISO. That's the newest one within the kind of the chain, as it were. And basically we can set it so that we can put in manual mode, but using an auto ISO will actually give you an automatic override of some kind. Full auto P doesn't stand for professional. I absolutely guarantee you that. And I'll almost beg you and plead with you, unless absolutely necessary, don't kind of stick the camera on P and things if you're a photographer and you're really trying to learn your craft. Aperture priority, this means if we are going to use an automatic mode in some way, I would definitely opt for aperture priority in kind of good lighting. Why? Because I know I want to fix the creative with my lens choice and my aperture choice. Then I would allow the camera to kind of make it up as it goes along, as far as the shutter speed is concerned, and obviously the ISO, it will kind of balance all those. Then we have shutter priority, TV, or kind of called different things on different the cameras, but the shutter priority will give you the chance to set the shutter speed that you want to work with, and then the camera settings, aperture ISO, will then basically work themselves out to give you what it tries to be, that kind of grey normal scene, as it were. And of course, you've got the auto ISO on all of those settings as well with it and things, which we can use it a bit like the manual plus auto ISO, as I said. The one way that you can override the auto in camera, of course, is compensation. That's where you can kind of move that little dial at the bottom. So in other words, if you know that if you're looking at a snow scene and it will underexpose it, it means that by default, you know you're going to put a +1 or towards a +2. That's that kind of default. If you're working in a very dark location, We used to kind of call it the coal house, you know, the really dark kind of room, whatever. Then you're going to basically, the camera will try and overexpose it to give you more detail in the blacks. Whereas what we're really trying to do is actually give ourselves a true black. So this is where you would underexpose that image in the compensation in the minus side to give you -1 or -2 stops with it and things. So you can still kind of control this. A typical example would be shooting a sunset. It's either going to try and give you a lot of detail in the rocks on a seascape, or it's going to just expose for the sun. Depends on where the camera exposure point is being kind of analyzed from. So in the camera compensation, what you're really looking to do is learn those techniques, specifically if you are planning to remain an auto exposure photographer and things. And there's nothing wrong in that, okay? Okay, so let's break down manual. The first thing is aperture for me, shutter speed for me, then ISO. For somebody who really wants the finest grain or noise, it's called in digital land, as it were, that's the kind of the granularity, the sensitivity, then obviously they would actually kind of keep a very low ISO. So in a manual exposure mode, we've got to kind of balance this triangle to kind of get the perfect exposure. So one point is aperture for me at the top. For you, it could be shutter speed if you're a sports photographer. So you might want to set, 4,000ths of a second. Well, then obviously the other two elements, aperture and ISO, have got to be there to actually balance it as well and things. As far as when we want to set a certain aperture and a certain shutter speed in the likes of, studio flash, well, studio flash is good, or even speedlight flash, is because pretty much we can control all the triangle because we can control the output of the flash. Whereas we're working on location on a dull, dark day, we're probably going to use a wider aperture or a slower shutter speed or a faster ISO. On a very sunny day, we're probably going to use a bigger aperture, a faster shutter speed, and a small ISO. So to keep the qualities there. And that's that exposure triangle. So first of all, it's easy if you identify yourself as a certain type of photographer. If you're on holiday, I would say probably the easiest way to kind of think as far as your exposure is concerned is you're a kind of a street photographer. And basically that's what you're going to be photographing. However, if you're sat on a beach at sunset and you want to record those beautiful colors, but you want detail in the sky rather than the detail in the rocks or the sea in front of you, we're then obviously going to be taking the exposure from the actual lights of the sun and things, really. So for me as a people photographer, working outside on location, the creative elements that I want are lens and aperture. Aperture for me is anywhere from f4 to 2.8. Sometimes it's wider than that again. But if I'm photographing a group, I need more like f5.6 to f8. Just because a manufacturer says, use the mid-range aperture, remember our real goal for creatives as photographers is concerned is to use the aperture that we command instead of allowing the camera to command it for us. And that's obviously the likes of P mode where you can't even take any control. So if I was going to work in an automatic mode at all, I would work in a aperture priority with a fixed ISO for the scene. In other words, bright and light 100, dark and dull 400, very dark 800 and above. Then I will allow the shutter speed to actually take the control. If it's very, very dark though, of course, the biggest problem with that then, you're going to have shutter shake. So I'd need to actually ramp up the ISO to make sure that the shutter speed is fast enough so I'm not going to get any kind of movement within the camera. If I was a sports photographer, like I touched on before, probably I'm going to ramp up the shutter speed very fast to freeze the subject. And I would obviously have a higher ISO to help me do that. And then I would actually balance the exposure triangle with the aperture. When we're working in a studio environment, as I mentioned already, flash, we can basically control the exposure triangle. But there are still times perhaps where we want to take more use of the modeling bulb. So in other words, you might shoot with flash in studio studio environment where the flash have a modeling bulb, or you might be working in a hotel room where you've got some ambient lights, side lamps or lights on the walls or whatever, and you might want to pick some of that information up. So if we're looking to remove the detail in the ambient light, so in other words, light in a room or the light from the likes of a studio flash bulb, then we want to work in a higher shutter speed, something like 125th to 200. If we want to pick up the exposure of the natural lamp within the room, so in other words, record some detail in the lamp. I'm not talking about the lamp being the main part of the exposure, but if we're looking for it to have detail in the room, we want to work somewhere around a 15th of a second if you can hold it that long, because that will naturally kind of bring the room lights in if you're working on the likes of 100 ISO. However, if you cannot hold the camera as kind of steady as that, obviously then you've got to kind of move the shutter speed up. So from a 15th, you probably want to move it to a 60th. That's the likes of 2 stops, which means that in the ISO, we would then move the ISO from 100 to 2 stops. So one stop is 200 ISO, another stop is 400 ISO. So that would actually give us the even balance, and then we've still got control of using the aperture. Remember, when we're kind of using a very small aperture, like f8, 11, 16 and so on with it, you're going to have to kind of balance out the exposure by either using a very slow shutter speed or ramping up the likes of the ISO and things really. I know it sounds complicated, but the best thing that you can do is basically pick your camera up, kind of go outside, pick a point within the lens where you want to actually take your point of exposure to begin with, and then basically start your exposure testing from there. Literally just before I started this film, I whipped outside and I kind of just came up with the garden here, okay? And so the first shot that I did is basically a manual exposure, and we can tell that because of the information in the camera data here. It's showing a manual exposure. What I did is I chose a working aperture of f4, as you can see on the screen. I used the ISO 100 to keep the kind of the grain sharp, and because it's so sunny outside today, we're using a shutter speed of 640 to give me the working detail. Now, once more, because of all the density of this image, this has lots of grays like the other images that I was showing to you beforehand. So when we then took some more exposures here, this is now in auto mode, as you can see. And basically, in the auto mode here, it's now at 5.6 400th of a second, and it's ISO 100. Now, if you can't get to see what standard mode that you were in, you would tend to actually think that this is the likes of an aperture priority or a shutter priority to kind of freeze those events. The interesting thing though, from the left-hand image to the right-hand image here, what we're now seeing is basically an underexposure. This is in aperture priority. I fixed it at f4. It's kept the ISO, but it's tried to kind of darken down the image because it feels that the wall in the bottom is too light and bright. So it's bringing the exposure down. And obviously, this is the problem when we're working with the likes of auto mode. You tend to actually find that every one of the images that you're doing needs a slight kind of adjustment in the likes of Lightroom or RAW and so on with it. So this is kind of giving us a different kind of working image and obviously setting up for it and things. And then the other one here is pretty much in program mode. It usually defaults to the likes of an aperture of f8. It kind of goes mid-range of everything. And then it's basically kind of working through here. But as you can see, it's fixing it at the ISO because of the very, very bright day and things. So I mentioned about the kind of the different exposures and everything else with it. Here's kind of the manual exposure of 2 images. And you can see, if I just put those side by side for a minute, you can see the difference now in basically an exposure where I'm trying to give information to the scene, and then an exposure where we're trying to actually dial in that kind of change here, where it's just being moved. So if we're looking at this bottom dial on the exposure, in camera you'll usually find that it will be -3 to the left hand side to a +3 on the right hand side. So when we start to look at those images, probably the image on the left hand side is a slight overexposure, or the correct exposure I should say, sorry, because of the tonality throughout. It's generally all a mid-tone, and the image on the right hand side is when I'm specifically making the darker lighting as such. Why would I be doing that? I'd be doing that specifically if I was trying to overpower the ambient with some flash and things. So when we start to work within an image, let's just bring this up into RAW. So I'm just going to open this image and go to Control R, and this opens it up in RAW. And as you can see, there's basically no adjustments being made to this image. And the reason being is that we can tell from the original image, just in the background still, that there's no 3 little lines and dots and everything else, which means it hasn't had any adjustments. So when we start to then look at this image as a whole, let me just make that bigger. What we're doing with compensation, in fact, if we kind of grab the exposure slider here, if we were doing this in camera and we were increasing the slider by a stop, you can see how bright it's becoming, and then we've lost a little bit of the detail there. If we kind of go to the minus way, we can see how dark it's going to be there. So one stop really does make a big difference. But what we're trying to avoid is having to change our working aperture in compensation so much. So we're having to think about things instead of knowing the technique. So really what I'm on about is, if you are going to work in an auto mode, then think about the -3 to the +3. When you're working in manual mode, think about these dials as well, about how you're going to make the adjustments to do with the scenes, if it's a very, very bright scene, or whether it's a very, very dark scene, like I mentioned about a snow scene or a very dark room scene. And by doing that, I can guarantee you will have more images that you hit and more of a perfect exposure running throughout your shoots, and you'll find yourself editing for creative reasons instead of for correction. So remember, it's not bad to shoot in auto mode, it's just a bad habit if we don't try and experiment and learn other skill sets as well. Good luck.